Hi, everyone, and welcome to Designing for Accessibility. My clock is showing 9:35, so I am going to go ahead and get started by actually dropping a link to a resource document in the chat. So this has links to all of the tools that we'll be talking about today, as well as a couple other resources that I really like and I really find helpful. So you can go ahead and open that link up if you want to follow along with anything, or you can check it out later. And please let me know if you have any issues accessing the document in that link. All right, so my name's Heather Mortimer, and I am a designer and writer on the Globe Observer app. And I'd like to start by defining designing for accessibility. So anytime you create a product, so something like a video, a document, even a device or a building, you're designing something. And while I am a professional designer, you don't need to be trained or professional to be a designer. Especially in this presentation, I'll be just using the term designer to refer to anyone who participates in design. Accessibility can be defined as ensuring access to people with a wide range of abilities, especially people with disabilities, either directly or through the use of assistive technologies. So for this presentation, we'll be focusing on types of products that are typically accessed through the internet, such as web pages, documents, presentations, videos, and podcasts. And the reason why is that as a global program, we interact and share information largely over the internet. And in the past year, because of COVID-19, a lot of our activities have moved online, which comes with an added benefit of allowing unprecedented access to our digital resources. That also comes with a new challenge of making sure that our materials are actually accessible to everyone who might be coming across them. So what is a disability? There are a lot of different ways to define the term disability, but for this presentation, we're going to think about disabilities as the combination of a condition that someone has with an environment that creates barriers to their equitable participation. So here I have a sort of like a Venn diagram, and on one side you have a condition, temporary or permanent, that occurs at any age. And on the other side, we have an environment that is not designed to accommodate diverse users. And it's actually where those circles overlap that you wind up with a disability. So as designers, we usually can't change the condition that someone has, but we can change the environment that they're interacting with to minimize the impacts of the disability. So for this presentation, we'll be focusing mostly on the types of disabilities that are most likely to affect someone's ability to use a computer and access the internet. And we'll go ahead and start with visual disabilities. So someone with a visual disability may experience blurred vision, difficulty with contrast, gray or dark spots, color blindness, or even complete blindness. And so here I have two different vision tests. The first one, these three larger circles that are made up of smaller circles, are for testing color blindness. And so if you're able to easily distinguish between different hues, you can tell that that first circle, most of the circles that make it up are kind of in different red shades. And then there are green circles in the center that actually form the number 74. If you are colorblind, you may be having a hard time seeing the 74 in the center. Same with the 6 in the next circle and the 42 in the bottom circle. The next test is for visual acuity. So you've probably seen this in a doctor's office, and they might have asked you to read as many letters as you can. And you can see they reduce in size until you can no longer easily read the letters. So the reason why I included these is that these are great as vision tests, but you don't want to unintentionally make something else a vision test. So if you're creating a presentation, you don't want it to accomplish the same thing that these vision tests are accomplishing. And so people with visual impairments often use assistive technologies like screen readers and magnifiers. And I'm going to be talking a lot about screen readers today, so I want to go ahead and describe those a little bit for you. They work just like the name makes it sound like they work, where they read the content on a website or a document out loud to someone or convert it to a Braille device. But they don't quite work the same way that a human brain does when it's reading something. It's really looking at the structure of the website or the document. So that means that documents need to be set up in a way that screen readers can actually access that information. For example, the image I have here is actually the tags panel in Adobe Acrobat. So that's the structure I'm talking about. And while it has words on it, the screen reader cannot read those words because this is just a screenshot. It's an image. So the screen reader only recognizes that it is an image. And so it would need alt text for the content to be read aloud. And we'll talk about that a little later. For auditory disabilities, people can be deaf, hard of hearing, or they may even have difficulty interpreting speech, which is less of a condition of the ears and more language processing in the brain. So in order to be accessible, audio should be converted into another form, such as captions or a transcript, ideally both. And so there are a lot of built-in tools. If you don't have any, professional video editing software, you can add captions in YouTube. And you want to try to go in and edit the auto-generated ones just to correct any issues. So here you can see this is a screen grab from our trees science video. And if you were unable to hear, you'd have no idea what Laura was saying without the closed captions turned on. Motor disabilities can include paralysis, amputation, difficulty with fine motor control, and all of those different things can affect whether or not someone's able to use a keyboard and a mouse. So they may use an alternative input device. And you probably recognize this man. If you don't, this is renowned physicist Stephen Hawking. And he's actually using an alternative input device in this image. So he was mostly paralyzed, but he could move his cheek. And so there's actually a small sensor on his cheek right under his glasses. And he's using that to control his computer. In addition, people who are blind typically use keyboard inputs, especially when they're using screen readers, because if you're blind, you can't see the mouse pointer on the screen. For cognitive disabilities, people may experience issues with attention, memory, problem solving, communication, language processing. But luckily, a lot of the strategies that we'll use to help people with other disabilities also benefit people with cognitive disabilities. And then for seizure disorders, there's really only one thing to keep in mind. So we'll be covering that completely on this slide. Some people with epilepsy can have seizures that are triggered by flashing lights or moving patterns, especially if it's very rapid. So you just want to make sure if you're creating an animation or a video that you avoid any sort of flashing, flickering, or strobing, or a pattern that's moving very, very quickly. In addition to potentially triggering a seizure, Those things also tend to just kind of make everyone a little nauseous, so it's best to avoid them. But from captions and videos, or captions on videos, to ramps on buildings, accessibility really benefits everyone. One of my favorite accessibility solutions, which I have pictured here, is called an accessible pedestrian signal. And so this actually uses audio to let you know whether or not it's safe to cross the street. And so this one in particular, the way it works is you press it. If you can't cross, it tells you to wait. And then once the walk signal comes on, it beeps to let you know that it's safe to cross. And the reason I really like this is because I have a tendency while waiting to cross the street to stare at the sky, look at the clouds. If it's a long light, I maybe am taking a globe observer clouds observation. And so this also helps me not miss the walk signal because it's going to beep at me when it's safe to walk. So now we'll talk about some of kind of the easiest strategies that you can start implementing basically today to make your materials more accessible. And the first thing we'll talk about is color contrast. So color contrast, we usually describe it in terms of ratios. So enhanced contrast, that's really high contrast, designed specifically for people who probably have visual disabilities. You're going to want to use a 7:1 contrast ratio. For just most text, you're going to want to use 4.5:1. And then the minimum contrast for large text only and graphic elements is 3:1. First, you might be wondering if there's such thing as too much contrast. And so some people with Irlen syndrome can actually be sensitive to high contrast. So you do want to avoid black on white text or vice versa if possible, but you still want it to be high contrast. Next, you're probably wondering how you actually find out these magical ratios for color contrast. And luckily, there are quite a few different tools that you can use. So if you like desktop apps, there's one called Color Contrast Analyzer by TPGI. But if that one, if you don't want to download something onto your computer, there are also web apps. So I'm going to go ahead and show you Color Contrast Checker by WebAIM. And it's very easy to use. If you want to test different color combinations, you can either plug in the hex code here. You can put in the RGB values, or you can use the eyedropper tool and just pick up a color. So I'm going to pick up this green right here. And so this is letting me know that the green text on a white background has a contrast ratio of 4.59:1, which means that it passes at the regular level for both regular size text, large text, and graphical objects, but it doesn't pass at an enhanced level. So if I'm creating something for people who may not be able to see well, then I might want to choose something with a little higher contrast. And you can adjust the color directly in the contrast checker. So if I do want to flip this over to pass, I can actually just darken the color a little bit. There we go. So if you still want to use green, but you want it to be considered enhanced contrast, and really greatly exceed the minimum requirements, then you can just darken the color up. And now we're at 7.51:1. Another tool I really like is Contrast Grid by 8Shapes. And so I have a screenshot of it here. This is our entire color palette for the resources that Globe Observer creates. And it basically puts every single color combination on a grid. So you can check and see which ones pass and which ones don't pass. So if I wanted to know what the contrast ratio is for this blue text right here, I'd go down the column and find a white background, which is right here. It's the first one, and then come across to blue text. And I can see that the contrast ratio is 4.8 to 1, and it passes at the AA level, which is the regular text. So it can be used for regular text, large text, or graphical elements. And then perhaps just as important as color contrast is how you use color. So color is really, really useful to people who can distinguish between hues. So you don't want to avoid using color, but it shouldn't be used exclusively to convey information, because if someone cannot see or cannot tell the difference between certain hues, then they cannot access that information at all. So if you must use color coding alone, this happens a lot on maps. You want to vary the color and the brightness. And for an example of how that looks, there is this resource called Color Brewer. And so you can see, I'm going to go ahead and check colorblind safe, even though it doesn't affect anyone's on the sequential palettes, but you can see that they range from dark to light. So even if you cannot see color at all, or this was printed in grayscale, you could easily see that, you know, there's darker data over here and lighter data over here. So that's a really useful tool that I did include a link to in the resource document. And then if possible, use a method in addition to color, such as text or patterning. Related to that are creating accessible links. So all links should be distinguished by color, and then at least one other method, which for links is usually underlining. But then you want to make sure that text that's not a link does not look like a link, because that really just confuses everyone. In addition, you want to make sure that your hyperlinks are descriptive out of context. And the reason behind that is that someone who's using a screen reader can actually scan through for links. So if every single link in your document is click here, someone using a screen reader is just going to hear click here, click here, click here, click here, click here, and they're not going to know what link goes where. Our top observers, if someone hears that as link text, they have a pretty good idea of where that link is going to take them. It's going to take them to something that's going to tell them who your top observers are. There's a lot on this slide because there's a lot that goes into formatting text, but all of these things are really, really important, especially to people who have visual disabilities or cognitive disabilities. And so for more readable text, you want to use non-decorative sans serif fonts. So those are the much more simple ones. It's really tempting to use really fun fonts, but honestly, they're usually very, very hard to read, and you should only really use them for like a title if you do really want to include them. You also want to use default spacing, both between the letters and between the lines. That one can go either way. If it's too close, it's hard to read. If it's too far, it's hard to read. You also want to make sure it's 12-point font or larger. If you can, use left alignment, simple formatting, and bulleted or numbered lists. And then you want to use common vocabulary and simple sentence structures. So a tool I really like for checking that is Hemingway Editor. And so you can just copy and paste text straight into this tool. It's another web app. And it'll let you know if some of your words have simpler alternatives, or if your sentence structure is just way too complicated and that you should probably try to simplify those sentences down. So it really gives you some good ideas on how to improve your writing. And then people always ask about dyslexia-friendly fonts when I do these presentations. And unfortunately, there isn't currently a lot of peer-reviewed research supporting dyslexia-friendly fonts. That doesn't necessarily mean that they don't work, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they are bad. But I will say without a lot of evidence, it's not something necessarily that you should spend a ton of time on. Like if you're going to choose between tracking down a dyslexia-friendly font and developing an accessible color palette, go for the accessible color palette. And hopefully in a few years, we'll have a little more information on whether or not dyslexia-friendly fonts really help people. Next up, that's really important is organization and information hierarchy, because they help everyone scan documents and websites to find the information that they're looking for. But it's especially useful for people who use screen readers, or they're just using keyboard inputs or an alternative input device, because you can actually, in a lot of programs, you can hop between heading levels. So you don't have to scroll endlessly or listen to an entire document. You can just jump down to the content that you want. And then alternative text is really, really important. But I will warn you that unlike color contrast, there is no magic ratio for alternative text. It really is an art and not a science. But if you think about the experience of the person who is hearing the alternative text and you practice this, you'll get to a really good place for writing alternative text. So it's a little bit of a Goldilocks thing. You don't want there to be too little alternative text. So that means no alt text. The alt text doesn't convey the purpose of the image. There's important information in the image that just isn't captured in the alt text, so someone isn't accessing that content. You also don't want there to be too much. So you don't want to add alt text if there's already a caption with the same exact information, because then someone's just going to hear it twice. And you don't want the alt text to contain unnecessary information. So it's really perfect if it adequately and concisely describes the important information that's contained in an image. So I have a couple of examples that we can look at. So let's talk about the photograph first. Good alt text would be something like, a family looks for mosquito larvae in a watering can while using the Globe Observer app. It's not as good if you were to say an adult and two children are outside in a grassy area. Both children are wearing white shirts. The adult is wearing a blue shirt. One child is holding a phone. They are looking at a watering can. There are yellow and white flowers in the lower left. Because that is a whole lot of unnecessary information. You've probably lost someone. And when you think about it, if someone is unable to see colors, then they probably don't care what color the flowers are and people's shirts are. So that's an example of way too much and also too little, because it just doesn't contain the important information. Next is this diagram of the water cycle. It would be great to say a diagram shows 4 stages of the water cycle: condensation, precipitation, collection, evaporation. You don't just want to say water cycle. That's not wrong. It is the water cycle, but you're leaving out really important information that this graphic is conveying. So real quick, I just want to show you how to add alt text. I'm going to use my second slide as an example because, surprise, this is actually an image. It's not text on the screen whatsoever. So a screen reader has no idea what the text is in here. For most programs, you just right click and you can see the alt text. Hopefully this is showing up for you all. And I already entered it in here. So for this image, I wrote Globe Observer, want to do Earth science with NASA? There's an app for that. Get it on the Google Play or the Apple App Store. So nothing in addition. And it really contains the important information that was on that slide, even though the information on that slide is all in the form of an image and not actual text. So you've heard me talk a lot about PDF tagging. And unfortunately, you do need a software that you pay for in order to do PDF tagging. So something like Adobe Acrobat Pro or InDesign. And if you're really interested in doing this, there is a really awesome webinar series that you can check out that's created by Level Access. This was the first webinar series that I watched, and it was really helpful. And then I also included a link to a Health and Human Services document that I really find helpful. But I would do the webinar first because it's a very large document. But if you don't have access to these programs, you are going to have to rely on auto tagging, which isn't always super reliable, especially if you have a much more complicated document. But there are things that you can do to set your document up for success, essentially. You do want to add the alt text and captions to the images. You want to avoid using text boxes and columns. Use the built-in formatting tools like lists and tables, because hopefully those things will be tagged as lists and tables. But if you're just using hyphens or like emojis for your bullets, it's not going to recognize that that's a list. And then you want to use paragraph styles for headings. So hopefully those will get tagged as headings automatically because you have formatted them as headings. And so I have this analogy here, which you're welcome to check out. I want to leave time for comments. But basically all this slide is saying is that it's a process. So, you want to do the best you can and just keep building on your toolkit for creating accessible materials, so that you can, really wind up coming up with very robust accessible materials. So hopefully the slides will be available and you can read this if you want. It's semi-based on a true story. And these are my actual friends' names. But thank you all. Please, please, please let me know if you have any questions. This is something I'm really, really passionate about, so I will talk your ear off about it. My email is heather.j.mortimer@nasa.gov. And if you want to see some of the resources that we're using these palettes and templates for, you can find them at observer.globe.gov/toolkit. So yeah, if you have any questions, I hope I left at least a couple of minutes to answer questions. Yay. Thanks, everyone. I do also, so the pizza analogy, a lot of accessibility professionals use a dinner party analogy. But I really like pizza as well. So I like the pizza party analogy. Basically, you've probably experienced this before where you ordered food and then found out that like half of your guests can't eat it. And so, if you're trying to help with that, maybe next time you ordered a greater diversity of foods that more people could eat. But even then, people aren't really getting to choose what they want to eat. They're just eating whatever they're not allergic to. So really your best solution is, in this case, to allow people to create their own pizzas that meet their needs and meet their preferences. And your friend who's super duper late still gets to eat a warm pizza because everyone's just making their own pizza. And this is actually what I do at my house. We do pizza parties or pizza making parties instead of ordering. Yes, the Level Access webinar series is free. They ask you to provide your email. So that's kind of the one thing that you give to them. Although I don't think I've ever gotten, I don't think I've ever gotten like spam from them. So yeah, it is completely free, a free webinar from them.